Good afternoon, I'm Margot Stafford, the lead investigator at the Smithsonian Institute. These human remains were presented to us by the FBI. They were discovered in a duffel bag in the Sauhegan River in mid-July. The current date is August 2nd, 2024, and now we will introduce the teams that will be working on these remains.
We're the skull team. I'm Lillian, this is Sarah, and this is Lola.
I'm Katie.
I'm Margot.
I'm Ari.
And we're the thoracic cage and vertebral column team.
I'm Lewis.
I'm Alicia.
I'm Abby.
I'm May.
And we are the appendages team.
As you can see, the injured part of the frontal bone appears to be the same color as the rest of the surrounding skull, which indicates that this specific injury occurred while the victim was alive. And we can also tell that this is a perimortem injury, which is an injury occurring at the time of death because the depression does not appear to be healed or aged. And the injury was likely fatal because a depression like this could severely damage the brain, more specifically the frontal lobe, which is right about here.
Posterior portion of the skull, we can infer that the injury on the parietal bone also occurred after the victim's death due to its lighter color in comparison to the rest of the skull. This shows that the injury has had less exposure to the natural elements with no evidence of the healing process ever even taking place. An injury like this would have to be inflicted by a large amount of force using a sharp, hard object.
Looking at the teeth, we can see some decay, which tells us that the subject was either elderly or lacked access to dental care during their life. And if we look back at the molars, we can see a cavity filling, so we can infer that this person has access to dental care, so the decay might be due to age, but we can't be sure.
So here we have the vertebral column, and as you can see, there are no visible signs of fractures, and all the vertebrae are in place, and so there was no damage to the vertebral column. We also see that the vertebral column is a total of 61 centimeters.
By this, we can infer that they are a woman because women's vertebral columns are 61 centimeters versus man's who are 71 centimeters.
This is the subject's thoracic cage, which represents 3 broken ribs on the right side of the body.
Here you can see ribs 6, 7, and 8 are broken, and here on rib 6 you can see that there's a hairline fracture.
And on rib 7, it's a comminuted complex fracture, which breaks the bone up into 3 or more pieces, which also occurs on more brittle bone.
By this, we can assume that the person is older because we usually see this kind of break on more brittle bones.
And on rib number 8, it's a transverse break, which shows the bone is broken up into 2 pieces.
Lastly, we can tell that these fractures are perimortem because the breaks are more rigid than they would be if they were postmortem breaks. Perimortem breaks occur in wet bone. Wet bone tends to splinter more when it breaks, and that is why the bones are more rigid.
From this, we have concluded that the vertebral column has no injuries,
and that the thoracic cage has 3 broken ribs.
Based off of our observations, we believe that there was blunt force trauma to the ribs, and we believe that there was no trauma to the vertebral column.
And presented by this, we can make an assumption that she fell down the stairs.
Go.
Hey guys, we're at the crime scene with the appendages right here. The first injury that we saw was on the left hand. As you can see here, the index finger there's a compound fracture, which is typically due to hyperextension of the finger, and as you can see, there is no sign of bone healing, which means that this was perimortem around the time of death. Another sign tells us that the skin was still intact. That's where the bone is close to the skeleton, because if it was post-death, then there's a higher chance that it would be separated from the body, and the reason is the skin is still attached at the time of death. And then with the second set of appendages with the lower half of the body, the injuries that we discovered was on the right metacarpal, just above. You can see on the fibula, you can see a transverse fracture just an inch above that metacarpal, and that is typically due to sports injuries. Usually an inversion of the metacarpal could have caused this. As you can see, if you zoom in, you can see that the bone has fused together, showing signs of healing. So this must have been ante-mortem, which is before death. And yeah, that's all.
Okay. In conclusion, we have discovered the remains include a fracture of the first phalange, broken right fibula, broken 6, 7, and 8 ribs on the right side, a depression in the frontal bone of the skull, and a hole in the parietal bone. We have also determined that the remains are of an elderly male. Okay, on one summer evening, a woman had an altercation with her husband. As a result, the woman fell down the stairs, breaking 3 of her ribs, an index finger, and a depression in the frontal bone of the skull. Her remains were then put in a bag and dumped into the Sauhegan River. She obtained a hole in the parietal bone after being thrown in the river.
The end.